The Ashbourne Orphanage sat at the edge of a mist-shrouded English village, its walls crumbling, windows blackened with years of neglect. By day, the air reeked of damp stone and decay. By night, the silence was punctuated by whispers that no one alive could explain. Children had come and gone, some forgotten, some lost, and the locals spoke only in hushed tones of the place of sorrow. Rumors persisted of rooms that echoed with cries long after the occupants were gone, of hidden chambers where secrets festered like mold. Caretakers vanished under strange circumstances, and the orphanage ledger recorded more deaths than births, though no one dared investigate fully. This is the story of Ashbourne, a house of supposed refuge that became a tomb for the forgotten, a dark chapter of England's history that time tried, and failed, to erase. In the autumn of 1871, Ashbourne Orphanage loomed like a shadow at the edge of its small English village. Its stone walls, streaked with years of rain, exuded an air of desolation, while the surrounding grounds were overgrown with brambles and weeds. Parents whispered warnings to their children, "Never venture near, lest the house consume you in ways no one could name." Yet for many, it was the only sanctuary left, a place where the orphaned might find shelter, however grim. The orphanage had been newly staffed with a matron named Eleanor Blackwood, a woman whose reputation for strictness preceded her arrival. Villagers spoke of her discipline as both necessary and terrifying, a mechanism to maintain order amid chaos. Eleanor arrived carrying her small trunk, her posture rigid, her gray eyes surveying the building as though it were already alive, waiting, breathing, anticipating her presence. She climbed the steps to the main entrance and paused, noting the deep cracks in the stone, the peeling paint on the wooden doors, and the oppressive weight of years of sorrow embedded in the air. Inside, the scent of damp wood, mold, and faint decay greeted her. The orphanage interior was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, low-ceilinged dormitories, and hidden alcoves where shadows seemed to linger long after the light had passed. Faded paintings of children, their eyes too large and faces too solemn, hung crookedly along the walls. Eleanor noted each detail, meticulously cataloguing the state of the building while feeling an undercurrent of unease she could not explain. The first orphans were brought in shortly thereafter. They were quiet, pale children with haunted expressions, their small hands clutching each other for comfort. Some refused to speak, while others whispered strange stories of footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening and closing by themselves, and voices that carried through the night calling their names. Eleanor's gaze hardened, recognizing that discipline alone would not contain whatever lingered in Ashbourne's corridors. Outside, the wind moaned through the gnarled trees, carrying the faint echoes of a past that would not rest. Ashbourne Orphanage had welcomed its new matron, and the stage was set for a grim unfolding, a tale of sorrow, cruelty, and secrets buried beneath stone and shadow. The first signs of unease had arrived, but Eleanor Blackwood would soon discover that Ashbourne's true horrors were yet to reveal themselves. The children of Ashbourne were unlike any Eleanor Blackwood had encountered before. They arrived in clusters, silent and withdrawn, their eyes wide with a fear that seemed older than the building itself. Some were mere toddlers, swaddled and trembling. Others were older, wary, their small bodies carrying the stiffness of long nights spent in hunger or neglect. Eleanor quickly realized that this was no ordinary orphanage. The children seemed to carry within them the shadows of past inhabitants, as though Ashbourne had absorbed and retained every sorrow ever suffered within its walls. In the dormitories, the air was thick with the mingled scents of damp wood, unwashed clothing, and faint decay. Tiny beds lined the walls, each occupied by a child who shivered beneath thin blankets. Their whispers, though soft, traveled through the corridors like a low chant, a chorus of unease that Eleanor could not ignore. Some children spoke of seeing figures in the corners, pale and thin, who vanished when approached. Others described hearing footsteps pacing overhead when the upper floors were empty. Eleanor attempted to establish routine, insisting on order and schedules, but even her iron discipline could not suppress the children's strange behaviors. At mealtimes, some refused food, staring blankly into the distance. At night, cries would echo through the halls, some human, some not, leaving Eleanor pacing the corridors, lantern in hand, searching in vain for the source. She documented every anomaly meticulously, though no explanation offered solace. Rumors among the older orphans hinted at unspeakable truths. They spoke of secret rooms, of adults who disappeared without warning, of whispers instructing children in the ways of silence. Some claimed to have seen the graves of previous occupants, unmarked and hidden beneath the floorboards, though Eleanor dismissed these tales as the fearful imaginings of traumatized children. Yet each story, each whispered warning, added to the oppressive weight of the orphanage, a pressure that seemed to grow heavier with every passing day. Outside, the village murmured its own suspicions. Locals avoided the orphanage after dark, claiming the windows glowed with unnatural light, and that the cries of the children could be heard carried by the wind across the moor. Ashbourne was no longer merely a refuge. It had become a place of quiet terror, a house that seemed to breathe with its own malevolent rhythm. The children of Ashbourne were not merely victims of circumstance, they were witnesses to something far darker, a presence that would slowly tighten its grip on the orphanage and all who entered. Eleanor Blackwood's first night alone at Ashbourne was a revelation of the orphanage's true nature. The evening began quietly, the children asleep in their narrow beds, their pale faces turned toward the flickering candlelight. The wind rattled the windows, carrying with it a damp chill that seeped through the stone walls. Eleanor sat in the matron's office, reviewing attendance logs and medical notes, unaware that the building itself had begun to stay. Around midnight, a low, persistent creak echoed through the corridors. At first, Eleanor attributed it to the settling of the old stone walls, but the sound grew deliberate, rhythmic, and accompanied by a faint scratching as though something, or someone, was pacing just beyond her sight. She rose cautiously, lantern in hand, tracing the sound through the narrow hallways. Shadows shifted in corners, stretching unnaturally with each step of her lamp. The air carried an acrid tang, metallic and sharp, and Eleanor's pulse quickened. Reaching the children's dormitory, Eleanor found the room empty. Beds were undisturbed, yet tiny footprints appeared in the dust on the floor, leading toward the far corner where the shadows seemed thickest. A faint giggle echoed from the darkness, high-pitched, discordant, unchildlike. Eleanor strained her eyes, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw figures, small, pale, and indistinct, hovering near the ceiling, their faces turned downward, watching her. When she blinked, they were gone. The night grew worse. Doors that had been firmly closed creaked open on their own. Whispered voices filled the halls, too soft to understand yet unmistakably human. Eleanor's lantern flickered violently, throwing the long, distorted shadows of the room across the walls. Something brushed past her shoulder, cold and insistent, yet when she spun around, the corridor was empty. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps, and she felt the oppressive sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. By dawn, Eleanor returned to the matron's office, trembling yet determined. She documented every sound, every shadow, every whisper in her journal, recognizing that Ashbourne was no ordinary building. It held memories, presences, and perhaps the restless spirits of those who had suffered and died within its walls. She understood, with a dawning certainty, that her role as matron was not simply to care for the living children. It was to navigate a house that seemed to exist partly in this world and partly in something far darker. Eleanor Blackwood had survived her first night, but Ashbourne had revealed its first secret. The orphanage itself was alive, and its terrors had only just begun. Weeks passed, and Eleanor Blackwood grew restless with the orphanage's peculiar atmosphere. Strange noises and fleeting shadows were no longer limited to the night. They followed her throughout the day. Children whispered of secret passages, small doors behind cupboards, and tunnels beneath the floors. Though she initially dismissed such tales as childish fantasy, Eleanor's curiosity and unease grew, compelling her to investigate. One gray afternoon, Eleanor wandered the northern wing of Ashbourne, a section older and more neglected than the rest. The air was heavier here, with a dampness that smelled of rotten stone. She noticed a loose panel in the wall, partially hidden behind a faded tapestry depicting long-forgotten benefactors of the orphanage. Her hands trembled as she pushed it aside, revealing a narrow corridor beyond, dark and suffocating. A chill swept through her body as if the house itself were warning her to turn back. With lantern in hand, she stepped into the hidden passage. The walls pressed close, dripping with moisture, and the faint scroll of children's hands, etched deep into the stone, marked her path. The corridor ended at a heavy wooden door, warped by years of neglect. Pushing it open, Eleanor entered a small chamber, its contents sending a shiver down her spine. Broken toys, faded clothing, and the skeletal remains of a small animal littered the floor. Yet, more disturbing, were the crude inscriptions on the walls, dates, names, and cryptic messages that hinted at lives extinguished within this hidden space. As Eleanor explored, She discovered another door leading downward, a staircase descending into darkness. The air grew thick with a metallic stench, and a low, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. She hesitated, the lantern trembling in her grasp, but something compelled her forward, an irresistible urge to uncover the full truth of Ashbourne. At the bottom of the stairs lay a larger chamber. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing remnants of lives long forgotten, bones, fragments of clothing, and items of personal significance. Eleanor realized with horror that these were not mere artifacts of neglect. They were the remains of children who had vanished from Ashbourne over the decades. The orphanage had been keeping secrets, terrible secrets, and the hidden chambers were their resting place. Eleanor Blackwood understood then that Ashbourne was more than a house for orphans. It was a tomb, a place where the living and the dead coexisted in uneasy silence. And the house's darkest truths were only beginning to reveal themselves. It was a fog-choked morning when Eleanor noticed the absence of one of the older children, a boy named Thomas Hawke. His bed was neatly made, his belongings untouched, yet he was nowhere to be found. At first, Eleanor assumed he had slipped outside, as some of the older orphans occasionally did. But as the hours passed, the unsettling truth began to dawn. Thomas had vanished entirely. A search of the orphanage yielded nothing. Doors and windows were secured. Every corridor, every hidden alcove she knew of was scoured, yet there was no trace of the boy. Eleanor's unease deepened. The remaining children were silent, their gazes fixed downward, some shaking their heads as if to convey that they knew more than they dared speak. Whispers hinted at the hidden chambers she had recently discovered, suggesting that the house itself had claimed the child. Eleanor summoned the older orphans for questioning, but they were hesitant, terrified. One girl whispered of Thomas hearing voices that beckoned him into the walls, into shadows where no adult could follow. Another claimed to have seen his silhouette moving past the windows in the dead of night, vanishing as soon as she blinked. Eleanor's stomach turned as she considered the possibility that Ashbourne was not just haunted, it was active, claiming those who wandered too close to its secrets. By evening, the villagers had been alerted. Concerned parents and local officials arrived, demanding answers, but Eleanor could only recount the boy's disappearance. She noticed, with growing dread, that some of the villagers' eyes reflected the same terror as her own. Ashbourne was no ordinary orphanage, and its history of lost children was more than rumor. Dr. Thorne, a visiting physician, examined the orphanage with scientific precision, yet even he could not account for Thomas's disappearance. He suggested that children might have fled, only to be lost in the surrounding moors. Eleanor, however, knew better. She had felt the house's presence, the oppressive, almost sentient weight of Ashbourne pressing down upon her. This was no random accident. The house had claimed Thomas, and it was patient, methodical, waiting to ensnare again. That night, Eleanor patrolled the halls herself, lantern in hand, listening to the soft, insistent creaks and the faint whispering of the walls. Somewhere within Ashbourne, Thomas remained, or perhaps he had become part of the building itself, absorbed into its macabre rhythm. Eleanor understood with chilling clarity. In Ashbourne Orphanage, the living and the lost existed in a fragile, terrifying balance, and once taken, no child ever truly returned. As the weeks following Thomas Hawke's disappearance stretched on, Eleanor Blackwood's control over Ashbourne Orphanage became a tenuous illusion. The children grew increasingly silent, their eyes hollow yet alert, as though they carried knowledge too burdensome to share. Whispers followed Eleanor through the halls, and she began to notice subtle shifts in the house itself, floors creaking beneath invisible weight, doors closing when no one approached, shadows pooling unnaturally in the corners. Eleanor's own secret, long buried beneath her professional composure, was that she had suspected Ashbourne's darkness even before arriving. The orphanage had called to her, not merely as a matron, but as a witness, someone who could survive its terrors and document them. Her family had once whispered of Ashbourne, warning of the disappearances and the unspeakable acts rumored to occur there. She had ignored them, believing them to be exaggerated tales. Now, however, standing alone in the dormitory corridors, she understood that the stories were true, and that she herself had stepped willingly into the epicenter of its horrors. By candlelight, Eleanor pored over the orphanage's archives, ledgers, diaries of former matrons, and faded letters from parents. Each page chronicled not only the day-to-day operations but also a pattern of vanishing children, each disappearance unexplained and quietly buried. The entries hinted at matron after matron who had attempted to impose order, only to vanish themselves, leaving the building to swallow yet another generation of orphans. Eleanor's fingers traced the inked names of the lost children, her resolve hardening. She realized that to survive, she would need more than discipline. She would need understanding. Ashbourne was sentient, a force nourished by grief, fear, and the unresolved lives of the forgotten. It demanded witnesses, and it rewarded compliance with survival, while punishing curiosity with disappearance. That night, she tested her theory. Moving silently through the dormitories, she called softly for Thomas, whispering his name as though appealing to a hidden presence. The air shifted, cold and heavy, and for a moment she thought she heard a response, a faint, sorrowful echo, distant yet unmistakable. She dared not follow, fearing the walls themselves might claim her if she stepped too boldly. Eleanor Blackwood understood a horrifying truth. Surviving Ashbourne required secrecy, patience, and a willingness to navigate its labyrinthine horrors without challenging its authority. The matron's role was not simply to care for the children. It was to negotiate with the orphanage itself, a silent and insatiable force that consumed all who misstepped. It began with whispers, as it always did. A small group of children, huddled near the fireplace, spoke of hearing Thomas's voice calling from the walls. Eleanor Blackwood, ever vigilant, dismissed it at first as wishful thinking, until she realized another child, a girl named Lillian Moore, had vanished from her bed without a sound. The discovery plunged Ashbourne into chaos. Eleanor scoured the dormitories, examined hidden alcoves, and checked every door and passage she knew. The orphanage, however, seemed to have swallowed Lillian as effortlessly as it had claimed Thomas. No footprints, no signs of struggle, only the faint echo of a child's laughter that ended abruptly, as if cut off mid-note. Eleanor's heart pounded with dread. The house was alive, and it was claiming them deliberately. The remaining children grew increasingly withdrawn. They avoided certain rooms entirely, whispering warnings of places where the shadows seemed thicker and the air colder. Some claimed to have seen faint outlines of figures at the end of corridors, watching silently before vanishing when approached. Eleanor recorded every account, every strange sound, every eerie movement in her meticulous journal, knowing that no one else would believe her. Outside, the village's unease deepened. Villagers spoke in hushed tones of the missing children, and speculation turned to fear. The orphanage was no longer seen merely as a shelter. It had become a living tomb, a place where the young were not only forgotten but consumed. Even Dr. Thorne, who had once examined the building scientifically, admitted that something unnatural persisted within its walls, a force beyond logic or medicine. That evening, Eleanor patrolled the hallways alone, lantern in hand. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the broken windows seemed magnified, as if the house itself were aware of her fear. The whispering returned, soft and insistent, threading through the corridors like a pulse. Eleanor realized with a chill certainty, the orphanage was teaching her a lesson, marking the limits of her authority, testing her patience and resolve. Lillian Moore's disappearance was not random. Ashbourne Orphanage had patterns, a rhythm to its horrors, and Eleanor understood that if she wished to survive and protect the remaining children, she would need to decipher the house's rules before it claimed another innocent life. The disappearances of Thomas Hawke and Lillian Moore ignited the village into action. Fear had fermented into outrage, and a contingent of villagers, led by the local constable, approached Ashbourne Orphanage determined to uncover its secrets. Lanterns in hand, they crossed the mist-laden grounds, their footsteps crunching over the frost-covered earth, unaware of the oppressive weight of the building they dared to confront. Eleanor Blackwood, anticipating the intrusion, met them at the entrance. She explained the building's history with a calm that belied the tension inside her chest. She spoke of the hidden chambers, the anomalies among the children, and the oppressive, almost sentient atmosphere. Her words, measured yet urgent, struck a chord of disbelief mixed with fear. The villagers, fueled by panic and righteous indignation, were unswayed. Many accused her of complicity, of turning a blind eye to horrors she could have prevented. The investigation began in earnest. Every room, corridor, and passageway was searched. Walls were probed, floorboards pried, and cellars examined. Yet Ashbourne seemed to resist intrusion. Doors slammed unexpectedly. Corridors twisted in ways that disoriented even the most determined searchers, and whispers of the missing children echoed from unseen corners. Shadows darted at the periphery of lantern light, only to vanish when approached. The villagers began to question whether the orphanage itself was alive, conscious of their intrusion, aware of their motives. Outside, fear spread through the village. Rumors escalated into legend. Some claimed the missing children were still inside, hidden or trapped in unseen chambers. Others whispered of a curse upon Ashbourne, fed by grief and neglect, that ensnared all who lingered too long. The line between reality and superstition blurred, but the consensus was clear: the orphanage was dangerous, and the longer the village ignored it, the greater the peril. Eleanor, meanwhile, moved silently among the searchers, guiding them where she could, recording every sound, every shadow, every unexplained occurrence in her journals. She understood that the villagers could not grasp the full scope of Ashbourne's horrors, only survive its presence long enough to bear witness. By nightfall, the investigation concluded with no answers, and the village retreated in fear. Ashbourne Orphanage remained, unyielding and inscrutable, a living tomb that had survived scrutiny. And Eleanor Blackwood knew that the house's power was growing, its appetite patient, deliberate, and far from satiated. Eleanor Blackwood soon realized that Ashbourne Orphanage demanded a certain order, a rhythm to which it expected its inhabitants to conform. The disappearances of Thomas Hawke and Lillian Moore were not random acts of cruelty, but part of the house's method, a ritual, unspoken yet rigid, that fed on fear, obedience, and silence. Those who ignored its unwritten rules vanished. Those who complied, however reluctantly, survived. One night, Eleanor observed the remaining children in the main hall. They moved with a quiet synchronicity, whispering only when absolutely necessary. Their heads were bowed, eyes alert to the slightest creak of the floorboards or murmur in the walls. It became apparent that the children themselves had learned Ashbourne's expectations, instinctively maintaining a fragile truce with the building's malevolent presence. Eleanor, watching from the shadows, felt a chill of understanding. The house communicated in whispers, gestures, and patterns, and only those who listened could endure. Determined to maintain control, Eleanor instituted what she quietly termed the ritual of silence. Each day, the children were instructed to move quietly through the corridors, to speak only when necessary, and to respect the hidden chambers as sacred, untouchable spaces. She enforced this discipline with a combination of stern authority and protective care, aware that defiance could summon the orphanage's hunger. At first, the children resisted, their fear mingled with frustration, but gradually they adapted. They learned to move as one, to anticipate the subtle cues of the building, and to maintain a precarious balance between compliance and survival. Even Eleanor herself felt the weight of the ritual. She adjusted her routines, keeping her movements deliberate, her voice measured, and her presence unassuming. She came to understand that Ashbourne was an entity that responded not to force but to respect, to the careful negotiation of boundaries. Each day of obedience became a silent offering, each night of quiet a shield against the building's appetite. Yet the ritual was fragile. One misstep, one whispered word too loud, and the walls themselves seemed to tense, ready to claim another. Eleanor realized, with growing dread, that she and the children were bound to Ashbourne in an unbreakable contract, a covenant dictated by the house itself. In the darkened corridors of Ashbourne, silence was survival, and every echo of the past whispered a warning. Defiance was deadly, and the orphanage claimed what it would, when it would. By the winter of 1872, Eleanor Blackwood had established a fragile equilibrium within Ashbourne Orphanage. The remaining children, cautious and subdued, moved through the halls with an almost instinctual awareness of the building's moods. Yet even as the rhythm of silence persisted, Eleanor sensed that the house hungered still, biding its time for the next claim. It came in the form of a girl named Margaret Blythe, no more than 6 years old, brought to Ashbourne after her parents' untimely deaths. From the moment Eleanor laid eyes on her, something felt different. Margaret did not flinch at shadows, nor did she cower at whispered voices. Her gaze, unusually steady and dark for one so young, seemed to acknowledge the house itself, as if she recognized its presence and accepted it. The other children were wary of her, whispering that she knew things they did not, and Eleanor felt a shiver of foreboding. The night Margaret arrived, Eleanor patrolled the corridors with heightened vigilance. The building was restless, groaning beneath the wind and the weight of its own secrets. Yet Margaret's cries were rare, her movements deliberate. Eleanor suspected, with an unease she could not fully articulate, that Ashbourne had found in Margaret a child unlike the others, one it had chosen. In the following days, the children adjusted their routines once more, teaching Margaret the ritual of silence. She obeyed effortlessly, moving through the halls with a quiet confidence that unnerved even Eleanor. At night, when whispers slithered along the corridors, Margaret did not flinch. Some nights, Eleanor swore she saw the girl standing near the walls, gazing into shadowed corners as if communicating with something unseen. Then, one cold morning, Margaret vanished. Eleanor found her bed neatly made, her few belongings untouched, and no trace of her in the orphanage. Unlike Thomas and Lillian, there were no whispers, no fleeting shadows, only a profound, unbroken silence. Eleanor understood immediately. Margaret had become a part of Ashbourne itself. She had crossed a threshold no one else had, drawn Philly into the orphanage's timeless hunger. The remaining children huddled in fear, whispering only enough to survive, while Eleanor documented everything in her journal. She knew that Ashbourne had claimed its final child, not in haste, but with deliberate patience. In that moment, Eleanor realized the ultimate truth. The orphanage was not merely a home, nor a tomb. It was a living entity, shaping, consuming, and preserving its secrets, and Margaret Blythe had become its latest testament. Decades passed, and Ashbourne Orphanage slowly faded from the collective memory of the village. The building remained, crumbling and overgrown, its windows blackened, its stone walls weathered by rain and time. The children who had survived, few in number and forever changed, carried the house's shadows within them, a silent testimony to the horrors Eleanor Blackwood had witnessed. Ashbourne had outlasted both caretakers and investigators, its secrets sealed behind locked doors and hidden chambers, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul. Eleanor herself aged quietly within the orphanage, documenting everything she could in journals that would eventually vanish along with her. She became a figure of legend. Some whispered she had disappeared into the building, absorbed like Margaret Blythe, while others insisted she had left, carrying the weight of the house's mysteries into the wider world. Few dared question the truth. Ashbourne had left an indelible mark on all who knew it, and the villagers had learned. That curiosity came at a price. The orphanage, abandoned yet alive, continued to breathe. Windows rattled with unseen wind, doors creaked open in the dead of night, and distant whispers echoed from the hidden chambers. Travelers reported strange sounds emanating from the ruins, and local children, warned by generations of parents, dared not approach. Ashbourne had become more than a building. It was a monument to forgotten lives, a tomb for the lost, and a testament to the unnatural intelligence of its walls. Historians who later attempted to uncover the truth found only fragments, scattered journals, partially legible ledgers, and whispered accounts from elderly villagers. Each fragment hinted at the horrors that had transpired, yet none could fully explain the disappearances, the patterns, or the inexplicable behaviors of the children who had survived. Ashbourne Orphanage remained a riddle, a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of England's countryside. In the end, Ashbourne was forgotten not because it had ceased to exist, but because it demanded it. Forgotten by the living, yet never by the house itself. It waited patiently, eternally, for the next child, the next matron, the next visitor who would step across its threshold. The orphanage was a tomb, a guardian of secrets, and a silent witness to the macabre truths that mankind was never meant to understand.